Good morning. Welcome to Mills County Roots. Recently, I had the pleasure of attending a speaker event at the Mills County Historical Museum in the Glenwood Lake Park. The speaker was Eric Van Vliet, and he was just eloquent in his presentation. He did a beautiful PowerPoint presentation on the USS Iowa ship. Stay right here because we're going to play the video.
Thank you everybody for coming to our speaker event. This is our first speaker event in a series we're going to have. So our speaker events will be every second Sunday of every month. And we're doing this to try and reconnect with the community more and provide free educational opportunities. And we also, in doing this, are looking for people that want to come help volunteer in any of the areas we have in any of the buildings. So for this building, for example, it's all cleaned up and new, and that's thanks to our volunteers and board members who have worked very hard for this past month. So our speaker event for today is about the battleship USS Iowa. And Eric Van Vliet is going to be our presenter for today.
All right. Thank you. Can you hear me all right, or do I need to use the mic? Okay. I was supposed to, we rehearsed this morning. I was supposed to have this slide up when she spoke. So, sorry, Lauren. All right. I'm Eric Van Vliet. I grew up across the river, graduated from Bellevue High School, went off to the Marine Corps after high school, spent 4 years in the Marine Corps and the Marine Corps Reserve. Then went to the University of Nebraska, graduated with Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering. And then I worked for 36 years in Corona, California at the Naval Surface Warfare Center, Corona, California as an electrical engineer.
This will be better.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right, as an electrical engineer. And there's our base right there with the Marines on the horses in front of it. And I worked in that building, which was a 5-foot thick concrete walls, reinforced steel, and a vault door on the front, because those are the kinds of programs we worked on. So, USS Iowa, the big stick, the gray ghost, the Battleship of the Presidents. Okay, we're going to talk about that in a little while, how it got those names. It's at 57,000 tons. It's a big ship. It's 3 football fields long. And it's only 36 yards wide. Does anybody have any idea why it's only 108 feet wide? Yeah. Yes, sir, Jim Carney, yes. The Panama Canal's 110 feet. So you got a foot to spare on either side of the ship when it goes through there. It does have a draft of 37 feet, so you need 40 feet of water for it to sail in. It's fast. 38 knots, 38 miles an hour, that's fast. And then on the hull is armored with, what's 121? 10 feet of steel, of armor plate. And then the turrets, where the guns are, that's 19 inches, a lot of steel. And during the World War II era, there were 2,700 crew. When they brought the ship back in the Reagan years, it was much less, 1,800. And that's partially because they didn't have as many guns, and the guns need a lot of people to man them. The other reason is, in the 1980s, you didn't need 15 guys with charts and maps and everything to navigate. You needed a Garmin with a GPS on it, right? So there were a lot of things that went away. So what is a battleship? Like the Supreme Court judge said one time, he couldn't define pornography, but he knew it when he saw it. The same thing with the battleship. It's hard to define, but this is Webster, that's pretty weak, okay, in my opinion. Your dictionary, largest size, greatest number of weapons in class with the heaviest armor, compared to what? One Navy is different than another Navy. I like this one. and the size, protection, and armament. So by that definition, it's huge. The Iowa's huge. It's got all of that 10 feet of armor, and it's got the 9 guns and 25-inch guns and so forth. So that's what a battleship is. Okay, what's a ton? You always hear about how ships are so many tons, all right? Well, a ton is you put the ship in the water, it displaces so many gallons of water, you weigh the water, and that's what the ship weighs. So the long ton's 240 pounds, which is 20 hundredweight, 112 pounds or 8 stones, in case you were wondering. So the Iowa weight down there is 57,540 times 2240. It weighs 128,889,600 pounds if you took it out of the water and put it on a scale. To put this in perspective, an aircraft carrier is 100,000 tons, and they're coming out with cruise ships now that are, this one, the Royal Caribbean, is 98,000 tons. The Ford has a crew of about 4,500 people on it. The Royal Caribbean Oasis has, I think, 4,500 passengers and 2,200 crew, so way over 6,000. That's not my idea of a vacation, but I know some people like that. The early battleships, the Gloire French ship was the first ironclad that could be in the ocean. Some other people experimented with ironclads that you had to, that were okay for small bays and harbors, but the first ones that were ocean going, the Gloire was the first one. And then the Monarch in 1869 was an English ship. It was the first ship that had turrets. So on the Gloire, you have 8 guns on each side, but you can only shoot 8 at one time because the guns on the backside are useless. If you have the guns on the turrets, like on Monarch, then you can move the guns around and you don't have to have guns on this side and this side. You'll notice that there are masts on the ships, even though they have steam power. They didn't trust the steam engines. You know, you had your old diehards, yeah, you gotta have masts, you gotta have sails. And so for a while there, a lot of ships had both. Now, this is my opinion only, but I think that the first United States battleship was the Monitor. And the Union Navy found out through spies that the Confederates were configuring an ironclad battleship. And so they scrambled, they found a guy named Ericsson, and he was Swedish, and he designed this ship. And the thing about this ship, no other ship before it had a turret. This turret right here on top's got 2 cannons in it. And so you can spin it around and get real accurate fire and everything. It was also very low to the ground, to the ocean water, and it had a lot of armor underneath the water. So it was an armored ship with the guns. I consider that a battleship. It was slow, 7 miles an hour, and it was built at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Now, keep that in mind, that comes up later. This is the Battle of Hampton Roads. All right. Hampton Roads was important because the Confederates were in Richmond, and in Richmond here, it doesn't work. The Confederate capital was in Richmond. The Confederates were down here in Norfolk, Virginia, and that's where all the rail yards and stuff were. So when English or French ships came to supply the Confederacy and take the cotton back to Europe, they could drop it off here and here. So what the Union did is they blockaded Hampton Roads Harbor right there. This is the location of 2 Union ships that were sunk during the battle. Let's go on the right way. So there's the Virginia. It was originally a Union ship called the Merrimack that sunk. The Confederates refloated it, put all this armor on it. The armor was kind of at a angle so that the cannonballs bounced up. And in one of the great coincidences of history, and there are many in history, the Virginia on the 8th came and started shelling and sinking the Union ships. So there's a picture at the Library of Congress right here of the Virginia ramming and sinking the Cumberland. And that went on all day. They sunk 2 ships, the Cumberland and the Congress, and they ran 2 aground. And the next day, the Confederates were going to come off and finish off the Union Navy in Hampton Roads. Well, by this great coincidence, the Monitor showed up that night. It had been towed down from New York. It had been on its way for a week or 2, and it got there just in time. So the next morning, they had their battle, and these 2 ships bounced cannonballs off each other for 4.5 hours, and nothing really happened until Virginia scored a hit on the pilot house, which was a little box where the guy steered. He could look out and crumpled up that pilot house, so the Union had to withdraw. The Virginia was so beat up from the day before and from being pounded by the Monitor, it went back to Norfolk and they put it in a dry dock. It was so busted up. The Monitor stayed on station and protected Hampton Roads. So the press and the Confederacy said this was a great victory. We sunk 2 Union ships and killed over 200 of their sailors. But the Union was, we're still here. Our ships are still blockading, so we won. So really the Union won that battle. This is the aftermath. There's a dent. You can see the dent up there in the turret. And then here's some of the guys when they're just on station in Hampton Roads. That's an African-American sailor right there. Here's when they decided to tow it to North Carolina to get in another battle. They towed it to North Carolina to get into another battle. And what happened? On Christmas Day, 1862, and it sunk. Because the waves got so high. They were going to Beaufort, North Carolina to blockade that harbor. It was being towed by a ship called the USS Rhode Island, and it just started taking on water. It sunk. Most of the crew were saved, but 19 were lost. In 1973, they found the Monitor, and they raised the turret, and there's the 2 cannons inside the turret, and this kind of gives you an idea about how much room there was in the turret. After that battle with the Virginia, the guys in the turret could never hear again for the rest of their lives, from the guns exploding and the cannonballs bouncing off. There were 2 bodies they found when they raised this, and they had full rights at Arlington. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line here is that the United States, we showed the world that navies need to have turrets on their battleships. Other famous battleships, this is the Dreadnought. That's an English ship, and that set the stage. This is really with the armor. You can see the guns up there on turrets. This is the modern battleship. So for many years after the Dreadnought came out in 1907, they referred to battleships as dreadnoughts. Dreadnought meaning fear not. That's why they named it that. And then this is the Bismarck. You can see how wide that is. That would never fit in the Panama Canal. My note here. It was the Battle of the Denmark Strait. And this was in World War II. And this was in 1941 on 24 May. The Bismarck had been out for about 8 months, and it was the pride of the Nazi Germany Navy. And they went off and they were in the English Channel, raising heck with the English Navy. And at the Battle of Denmark Strait, they sunk the HMS Hood. The Hood was an English battleship, and 2,415 people went down. The Hood sunk in 3 minutes. There were 3 sailors on Hood that survived. So this really put a bee in the British's bonnet. They were heck bent for leather to go ahead and sink the Bismarck. They found the Bismarck the next day, on the 25th. They used torpedo planes taking off from a carrier. And so these torpedo planes flew out. They shot torpedoes at Bismarck. They disabled the steering gear and the rudder. And the next day, a bunch of English ships came and finished the job. So what did this prove? It proved that battleships are very vulnerable to aircraft carrier launched airplanes And so the era of the battleship is actually over, starting with the sinking of the battleship, and Iowa's still not out of the yard yet. So the writing was on the wall that these big gun ships no, aircraft carriers and submarines with torpedoes are the way we should go. The armor on the Dreadnought was approximately 6 feet. I do not have a note on the armor on the Bismarck. I'm sorry, but it was thick. The Bismarck was 49,500 tons. It had 8 15-inch guns, and it had around 1,900 crew members. But I don't know how thick the armor is, I'm sorry. I wrote all this stuff down on these cards in case somebody asked me, right? But of course, the question I didn't write down. What's the purpose? Well, in 1923, the Navy did a big think tank study, and they already knew we were going to have trouble with Japan. This is, 18 years before Pearl Harbor? Because Japan was crazily building a Navy. They were building big ships. They defeated the Russians in a battle in 1905, and we just had an idea we were going to have trouble with them. So we wanted these big battleships to protect Guam, Philippines, Hawaii, and the Panama Canal in case there was any Japanese aggression. This projected power, what this means is that this is now in the 1930s. We're thinking more and more about this. We don't want all of our ships out sailing around the Pacific all the time. It's expensive and it makes our ships wear out. So we're going to have these 4 battleships out in the Pacific doing picket duty, sort of keeping the home fires burning until if something erupted, then the home port ships will come out. So that was kind of the thought, is that we'd keep all our ships in Pearl Harbor, San Diego, Long Beach, and Mare Island up in San Francisco, and we'd let the Iowa-class battleships. There were 4 Iowa-class battleships: Iowa, Wisconsin, Missouri, and New Jersey. Thank you. And then finally, as we got closer and closer to World War II, the thought is that the Japanese had the Yamato and other battleships, that we were going to have this huge blue water battle, meaning out way in the middle of the ocean, no land in sight, where these 2 opposing forces would lob big bullets at each other for hours. And that never happened. There was never a blue water battle like that. All the battles in World War II were aircraft carriers, airplanes, all that. They didn't have battleships doing their thing. Ship military nomenclature. There's lots of Navy folks in the room, so a battleship is BB. USS Iowa is BB-61. Even back in 1890, when they started classifying battleships, they thought about using the term BS. But even then, they thought better of that, because that was cruisers or CLs, guided missile cruisers or CGs. So USS Antietam is CG-54. Our cruisers right now, the Aegis-class cruisers, are named after battles, Antietam, Philippine Sea, stuff like that. The destroyer, Fletcher, was World War II DD, and the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers now, DDGs, those are named after admirals and important Navy people. There's one DDG ship named the Sullivans, and it was named after the 5 Sullivan's brothers that all went down on one ship in World War II. After that, they didn't put brothers on the same ship. Yes, sir.
Yeah. What's the biggest thing with think battleships, cruisers, destroyers?
Well, the battleship is the armored ship with the big guns. Yeah. Cruisers traditionally were large capital ships, not as big as battleships or carriers, and they evolved into where cruisers are primarily for air defense. Destroyers have the depth charges and the sonars, hull-mounted sonars, things to detect submarines. And now they have vertical ASROCs, like torpedoes that go down and try to find the submarines and everything. And then frigates are the lightest ships, and the Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates were like all the above. They did air defense, submarine defense, surface gunnery. They just didn't do it very well. And those ships have been mothballed. Does that answer your question?
Destroyers probably protected all our commercial ships going over them, probably.
Yes,
Not the big battle.
correct.
Yeah.
Oh, and SSBN. We have a SSBN veteran here in the room. This SSBN 734 is USS or SSBN Tennessee. Now, the definition of the states, when do we name ships states? Well, for our grandest ships get named after states, and those SSBN Ohio-class submarines are grand ships. They're huge submarines. And SPY-1 radars don't spin anymore. They've got these array faces, and they electronically spin and look for stuff. It's a SPY because the Y means it does so much more than surveil. It detects, it tracks, it sends missiles out. For our Air Force friends in the room, here's a E-3 Century AWACS plane. That radar up there on top, the black and white stripe radar and the radome up there, that's AN means it's joint because there's a radar very similar to this on Navy planes. It's an aircraft, it's a pulse radar, and it's the surveillance detect tracker. And the Army representation here. This is an AN MLQ-44. That means mobile. L means countermeasures. Q means, well, we can't tell you. But something like that, they park it in front of the troops, and when a missile comes, it has some top secret stuff in it that makes the incoming missile go haywire. So that's what that thing does. Okay. So the Navy, when we knew we were having trouble with Japan, they went ahead and they authorized the building of these 4 battleships. And as we talked about before, since 1862, our grand ships are going to be named after states. Now, this dude here, Henry Wallace, he's from Iowa. He was from Orient, Iowa, which is in Adair County. It's north of Creston, not far from here. He was a big New Dealer. And so he had Roosevelt's ear. So in Roosevelt's first 2 terms, his vice president was John Garner. And John Garner was a Texan, a hard scrabbled Texan. They called him Cactus Jack. Roosevelt put him on the ticket in 32 because Roosevelt was kind of a New York liberal. They wanted a Texas guy, to have a broad tent. And so he was the vice president. Unfortunately, Garner and Roosevelt didn't get along during the 2 terms. Garner didn't like a lot of the New Deal stuff. Roosevelt said, we ought to pay artists to paint the interior of post offices. And Garner said, no, we shouldn't do that. Well, Wallace, he'd say, yeah, we ought to do that. And he's the Secretary in the Interior. He was considered further left than Roosevelt. So then when Roosevelt decided to seek the 3rd term in 1940, Garner didn't want to have anything to do with it. He didn't think you should have a 3rd term because George Washington didn't have a 3rd term. He rejected that. So Garner ran against Roosevelt in the Democratic primary, and of course he lost, and Roosevelt made Wallace his vice president. Well, towards the end of the 3rd term, the Democrats that were conservative in the Democratic Party felt that Wallace was too far out there as far as his beliefs. He was also rumored to be dabbling in Eastern religions like Buddhism and stuff. He was kind of a hippie, before we had hippies. And they dumped him. They told Roosevelt they will only support him for a 4th term if he dumped Wallace and picked Truman for his vice president. So anyway, all of that aside, this is why Iowa got to be the first Iowa-class battleship, is because the Secretary of the Interior was from Iowa. Okay, in World War II, all right. So the ship was supposed to be for the Pacific, but right after it was launched, we were having trouble with Germany, and we felt that Germany was going to maybe invade Iceland, Newfoundland, and Greenland. Hey, even then, we were worried about Greenland, okay? And so they put it in the North Atlantic for a while. Then Roosevelt was going to Tehran to have the first meeting with Stalin and the English Churchill. And he wanted to have a big stick. He wanted to sail up there to Iran in this big battleship. Also, Iowa was big enough that they could put a bathtub in there and a couple extra elevators for Roosevelt. And so it took him to the conference there. Now, as an editorial comment, there were, what did we say, 2,700 sailors on that ship. There was a whole bunch of newsmen and everything on that ship. Nobody took a picture of Roosevelt in his wheelchair and sent it to the National Enquirer. Really, nobody in the country knew Roosevelt was in a wheelchair. So compare that to now, where every step that a politician takes is on TV or in the paper or 24/7 news. You know, back in those days, people were a little bit quieter about what went on. So then the ship went through the Panama Canal and it was in all these battles, the island hopping campaign. So they would go to bomb for 2 days, the island, soften it up for the Japanese with these big 16-inch bullets, and then the Marines would land, they take over the island. Well, Tinian wasn't much of an island, but the Japanese had built a long airstrip on it. And so in 1945, we had our people on Tinian. They dug a big hole in the end of the runway. They put a bomb in it. They pulled the Enola Gay over it, winched the bomb up into Enola Gay, and away it went to Hiroshima. So Tinian was the first island they took that was really close enough to Japan that a B-29 Superfortress could fly there and back. 45, they were in the Battle of Okinawa. They shelled it, and then they went ahead and started shelling the home islands, getting ready for an invasion. Okay, I wasn't going to tell the story if there were kids in here because it's kind of gruesome, but there are none. So the Okinawa was the battle where the Okinawans weren't really Japanese. They were Okinawans, and the Japanese convinced them that the American forces were going to kill their children and eat them. And so there's video of the Okinawan people throwing their children off of cliffs and jumping off after them. That's how brainwashed they were that Americans were bad people. And then, of course, after the bombs and they surrendered, Iowa was in Tokyo Bay. They did the signing and all that on USS Missouri, but Iowa was there. And then post-war, I'm not going to talk too much about this. It was off of Korea and then just doing all kinds of training duty and stuff. And then eventually they decided to decommission it. All 4 battleships got decommissioned because we felt that the next war that we had was going to be with missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that we didn't really need battleships. But not to fear, not to despair. In '84, President Reagan wanted a 600-ship Navy, and so he brought the 4 battleships back out. And then they were at the Persian Gulf. They did a lot of big stick duty, floating around Europe and everything. And then there was the turret explosion in 1989, which blew apart the middle turret, killed 47 sailors. They put a Band-Aid, they closed that turret down, they Band-Aided the damage to the battleship, they sailed it around for another year, and then they was permanently decommissioned in 1990. President George Herbert Walker Bush was a carrier pilot. He really didn't have any, use for battleships. So Reagan was a battleship supporter, Bush wasn't. And then eventually, after being in Philadelphia and other places, it ended up in the Port of Los Angeles Museum, where it sits today. Nicknames, the big stick. Well, Teddy Roosevelt said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Well, this was Roosevelt's big stick, and that's why he took it to Iran, and because of just how big it was and the powerful guns and the size and the speed, he wanted to show that off. The Japanese called it the Gray Ghost because they thought they sunk it 3 times, and it came back. And so them being very spiritual people and everything, they started thinking of this ship as a ghost ship, that you couldn't kill it. And then the Battleship of the Presidents. Roosevelt, who had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy from 1912 to 1920, he reportedly started this whole thing by sketching out what the ship ought to look like on a bar napkin. And then the trip to Tehran. But, presidents don't go to ships a whole lot. And so for 5 of them to be there was kind of remarkable. President Bush recommissioned it after they took it out of mothballs in 1984. Ronald Reagan was on the ship for the Statue of Liberty 100-year anniversary. The ship was along the Hudson River. And most recently, President Biden had his economic speech at the museum ship in 22. And Trump wasn't the president. He was a candidate, but he had a big rally on the fantail, which is the back end of the ship, in 2015. So on the upper left there is the bathtub that they had installed for Roosevelt because Roosevelt couldn't take a Navy shower. On the upper right, there's President Reagan and Nancy with the Statue of Liberty in the background. Lower left, that's President Biden on his economic speech. And then lower right is the Trump rally. So the armament. You'll see that during World War II in Korea, it was guns, 9-inch guns, 5-inch guns, and the anti-aircraft guns. When it came back out of mothballs in 84, they had less guns. They still had the 9 16-inch guns, but they were down to 12 5-inch guns, and they added the cruise missiles and a self-defense gun and drones and modern. Now we're getting modern. So here are the guns. There are 9 of them. There's 3 in a turret, 3 turrets. They shoot a shell that weighs 2,700 pounds, 24 miles. You can see the bullets down there, the shells, where the sailors are. Those are the 2,700-pound shells. And then I did a web search on a car 2,700 pounds, and I found this Miata. So basically what the ship is doing is shooting a car 25 miles. A good crew could fire 2 per minute, and then they would put in 6 bags of powder, each bag weighing 110 pounds. So you need 660 pounds of gunpowder to shoot one of those bullets. So. Now they're going to shoot them in 3s. All right, that's enough. So there's the 5-inch guns, 5 inches, 55-pound shell. Those are used when you don't need a big gun, like if you have a pirate boat or a patrol boat, enemy patrol boat, or something off to the side. You don't train this big gun down there. You use the 5-inch gun. 5-inch gun also had proximity fuses, so the bullets got near an airplane, they'd blow up the airplane. Stuff like that, smaller jobs. These fire 15 rounds a minute. Boom, every 4 seconds, right? Boom, 1, 2, 3, 4, boom. They could fire faster, but you don't want the barrel to melt down. So they're kind of limited to that. You sailors know ships are very noisy places. It's not like cruise ships. There's something going on and lots of machinery running, and a lot of times you have to wear protective. All right, and then the Bofors 40mm ACAC gun to shoot down airplanes to protect the ship from airplanes, and the 20mm Oerlikon 20. Say that backwards 3 times. During the Battle of Philippine Sea, I believe Iowa shot down 13 Japanese airplanes with these guns. So, There's no sound on this clip. Actually, there is sound. The guy narrating saying, "These are our guns. These are wonderful guns. You should buy these guns." It's a sales pitch. So, are there any Star Wars fans in here?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I know there's at least one. Okay. There's the Bofors 40 millimeter on the upper left, and there is the Star Wars Death Star anti-aircraft. And you can't tell me that the people at Industrial Light and Magic that did the stuff for Star Wars weren't looking at the 40 millimeter gun when they designed that. So I got a real quick, don't blink or you miss it. But there it is. That was at the battle, I made a note of that, the Battle of Yalin, which culminated in blowing up the Death Star. That occurred a long, long ago, far, far away. Now, there's the 20 millimeter Oerlikon. Nobody can tell me that they didn't model the gun on the Imperial Walkers after the 20 millimeter. It's just, there was no reason for them to reinvent the wheel. All right. That was the Battle of Endor. Now we're in 1984. Here's a Tomahawk cruise missile. That was developed by the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins University in Laurel, Maryland, and then General Dynamics put it in production in Pomona, right over there by Ontario. Primarily because the proximity to the high desert and Edwards Air Force Base, and they could test them there. I've actually been driving up Highway 395 before and seen a Tomahawk go by. And it just freaks you out that they're flying them out there. But it's a turbofan jet engine. They fly low. They fly 100 feet. And you've seen them on TV attacking. We just used them to blow up the Iranian facility. They go to about $2 million each. There were two of them. Somebody's going to have a really bad day. All right, there's the cruise missile over the Tomahawk over the water. There's no sound on this clip, but there's a Tomahawk anti-ship missile hitting a ship. There's another TASM hitting the ship. And then there's a Tomahawk land attack missile hitting a bunker and another TLAM hitting a building. The way they do that, they guide themselves to where they have to go by. Once you shoot them, you don't really work with them anymore. They have GPS, they have terrain maps, and they have other secret stuff where they can find out where they're going.